Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
This is part 6 of What If Ichigo Lost His Zanpakuto in the World of One Piece. Credit goes to Unseated 4th. Chapter 17. Clouds gather up. Ichigo. A voice resounded to him in the darkness, prodding at his mind in his currently weary state. A lone figure stepped out of the vast nothingness, beckoning him to come closer. Ichigo, the voice sounded once again. Ichigo moved toward the figure, but with every step he took, his feet became heavier, until it felt as though he were wearing shoes of lead and could no longer take a step forth, much less shift either of his feet. Ichigo. The figure seemed to be searching for him, unable to see him. Unable to move, Ichigo tried shouting out to the figure to get its attention. But to his frustration, no sound left his mouth, and the figure continued back into the nothingness. "Please, don't go," his mind begged the figure, but it was to no avail. He tried to reach out a hand, but the figure was fading further and further away, until it seemingly disappeared from existence altogether, back into the hazy darkness. Zangetsu. Ichigo? A new voice sounded from elsewhere, jerking him from his sleep-induced trance. Ichigo sat up so quickly that he toppled out of bed and onto the sturdy atom wood floor beneath him. He groaned, rubbing his behind as he shifted into a sitting position. He then noticed Usopp laughing at him from across the room. "Nice one, Ichigo," the sniper cacked. "Good way to wake yourself up." "Good morning to you too," Ichigo muttered. He gazed out one of the windows, focusing his still half-slumbering mind. Had that been Zangetsu trying to contact him just now? What was he trying to say? Ichigo could feel that his connection with the Zanpakuto was still there. It hadn't been severed, not even momentarily as it had in Shangpyo. At least that was one good thing about his recent encounter. All the same, what had the dream meant? Was it actually Zangetsu trying to contact him, or was it just a jumble of his thoughts and worries presenting themselves to him in his sleep? It was hard to be sure. Noting how Ichigo's demeanor had turned serious, Usopp questioned him in poorly disguised concern. "You're acting kinda dumb. Is everything okay?" Quote. "Yeah," Ichigo said, running a hand through his bed hair and standing up. "I was dreaming, that's all." He exited the room, stretching his tired limbs. He'd been woken earlier, like everyone else, by Boris. This morning, however, he'd opted to drift back to sleep for a little longer. After all, he was up late last night. Last night had been odd. Luffy had been in such high spirits whilst they'd traversed their way into the depths of the jungle. But then after witnessing the sight of that palace, specifically the flag that blew in the wind above it, something had changed. Ichigo wasn't entirely sure what the flag meant, but if it made Luffy and Zoro react the way they did, it must have been a force to be aware of. And as curious he was to question the other two on what it meant, he figured that discussion was best postponed to another time, and that what they should be focusing on was returning to the ship. Zoro and Luffy had no problem with leaving the forest after the encounter. The only problem was finding their way out. It was getting dark, even more so seeing as the thick coverage of trees blocked out most of the sky, and with evening descending it was almost pitch black. And then of course, mingled with the combination of hopeless navigational skills and plain lack of paying attention to where one was going, the journey back to the ship proved tedious and time-consuming. It was a miracle they'd found their way back at all. Nami gave them an earful when they finally returned. It was late in the night, and she and the others were wondering where they'd gotten to, especially seeing as they'd headed back to the ship before anyone else and especially in light of recent revelations. The Tenryubito, they were called. The people who owned that palace. Who held unquestioned power not only over this island, but the entire world. Ichigo had only been given a small bit of information on them by the others, but was fairly sure he knew what they meant. And there were a group of them beyond the jungle, of all places. Robin and Frankie had informed them of what they'd discovered in the archives. Until only around 20 years ago, the island had condoned human sacrifice. That aside, the occupation of the world nobles was still present, and the Straw Hats had unanimously agreed on being more careful in their exploits on the island from then on. That aside, if the vast windows of Little Starport were any indication, it was shaping up to be a nice day. By late morning, the crew had dispersed for the day and Ichigo somehow ended up wandering the city with Luffy, Zoro and Usopp. Being their third day on the island, they'd seen many of the main attractions already. But there was so much packed into the city, that even when they walked a now familiar strip of Mesozoic Square, there was always something new to notice. They were passing a small vacant grazing park, when Luffy excitedly pointed out a holographic billboard for upcoming dinosaur tournaments at Triassic Emporium. It was still about half a week before they were due to depart, and there was plenty of time for more dino rallies. "Reminds me of something," Zoro said, eyeing Ichigo. "We haven't had a sparring match in a while." Ichigo grinned and glanced at the empty park. "Wanna change that?" Quote. "Well," said Zoro, "since you're offering." Ichigo withdrew the dark katana from the sheath along his back, having not made much use of it since Shangpyo. Likewise, Zoro unsheathed his own katanas and positioned them accordingly. "Ready?" Ichigo questioned as they stood in the small park. "Are you?" Zoro responded. Ichigo nodded and no further signal was needed. The blades met and sparks flew. Ichigo had almost forgotten how fast and strong Zoro was. As far as raw brute strength went, he was sure the swordsman was superior. He'd seen the kind of weights Zoro lifted. They'd be a strain for himself to lift at best, and certainly out of the question should he be in his normal human form. But in his Shinigami form, speed was something he could surpass all but the fastest Shinigami in. As such, Zoro sometimes had trouble keeping up with how speedy and agile Ichigo was. "They're just like the fighting dinosaurs from the arena," Luffy observed from the sidelines, where a small crowd of passers-by were gathering to watch. "You just gave me a great idea, Luffy," said Usopp. "Ooh. And what's that?" "Just wait." The sparring match continued in an onslaught of sharply clanging steel, the audience unable to detect who was blocking and instigating each respective attack, as the match descended into a whirlwind of strikes. Eventually, the two contenders leapt away from one another, marked in each other's piercing gaze before returning to the flurry. "And here's the Marimo coming in for the kill," Usopp's voice suddenly sounded in a very Dino rally commentator-like voice, "but the moon guy is too quick for him. Did you see that evasive technique?" Quote. Luffy's laughter followed before he joined in his friend's sharp commentating. "The moon guy looks like he's come up with a plan. But what will it be?" Ichigo gripped the katana's hilt with his left hand and covered the blade with his right. Hado number 33. Zoro's eyes widened in terror as the sound of what he'd come to know as the ringer for disaster passed his opponent's lips. Sokatsui. Sure enough, the explosive result was enough to send both contenders flying, scare the crowd away, and vastly entertain the two commentators. "It's a foul tilde," they chorused as smoke from the failed Kido proceeded to billow throughout the park. "Would you both shut up?" The smoldering Zoro and Ichigo both turned on the other two, who let out sounds of surprise and laughter before turning and bolting into the confines of a nearby shop. The two swordsmen took a moment to breathe and appreciate the sudden quiet that came with the other two's absence. "I thought they'd never leave," Ichigo said with a laugh. "Well, they've left now," Zoro observed, "don't count on them being gone too long though." Detecting a break in their battle and resheathing his single katana, Ichigo curiously looked on as Zoro slid the last of his, the pure white blade, back into its sheath. The words came out before they had even processed in his mind. "Why do you fight with 3 swords anyway?" Zoro looked over and shrugged. "Why do you fight with only 1 sword?" Quote. "Because it's what's natural to me, I guess." "Well, there's my answer. I've been practicing Santoryu for a long time," I guess it's what I most naturally adapted to with my abilities. I promised someone long ago that I would become the world's greatest swordsman, and I plan on achieving that with Santoryu. It's definitely unique, Ichigo admitted. I know several Shinigami who'd be interested in it. The fighting you part of it, that is. Zoro chuckled, that would be some great training. Speaking of which, when you get that real sword of yours back, we need to have a proper match. Sure thing, Ichigo said, before thinking back to the last time he'd used Zangetsu. I was actually having a sparring match with someone right before I arrived in this world and lost my Zanpakuto. We never actually finished the mock. I'm kind of on a detour at the moment to retrieve Zangetsu. I wonder if he thinks I'm still searching somewhere in that drainway. He can wait though, he's probably been waiting however long it's been since then. He'll probably want to kick my ass when I come back though. I don't blame him, Zoro said with a laugh, and hear people tell me that I get lost and take detours. Yeah well you do, Ichigo joined him in laughing. What about your sword anyway? Zoro asked in turn, a Zanpakuto, hey? And you refer to it as, he. Well, Ichigo wasn't sure where to begin. The full concept of a Zanpakuto was fairly complex. I wonder if whenever I die, I'll have something like that, Zoro continued, or if the spirits of these three blades will be revealed to me in some way. All blades have a mind, after all, he glanced down at his own katanas. It was true. Ichigo had sensed some sort of presence coming from each of the blades Zoro carried. Whether they were some form of Zanpakuto spirit or not however, Ichigo wasn't quite sure. You'd make an interesting Shinigami, he admitted. The Marimo and the Moon Guy defeated each other. Luffy's voice commentated from where he was hanging out of one of the shop's windows. We did not. Ichigo and Zoro retaliated. Luffy's intervention, while sudden and obnoxious, was enough to place the two back in the mindset of the match. There was nothing quite like approaching the coast of a tropical summer island. Smoker sighed in contempt, enjoying a brief moment of solitude in the warm sun as they approached the island known as Atlantica. But alas, brief moments didn't tend to last very long. Smoker-san. An obnoxious voice intruded his thoughts, Smoker-san, we have a problem. Groaning and grudging pulling out of his moment of tranquility, Smoker prepared himself for whatever idiotic situation would be befalling him this time. As soon as his eyes reached the spectacle, he knew he shouldn't be fazed. But even he was surprised by the sheer stupidity. Charlie and Merlin stood before him, both joined by the wrist. A pair of strong metal cuffs linked them. Merlin, who had spoken, was panically chattering away, whilst Charlie had turned a sickly pale color and looked as though he was partially depending on his idiotic partner for support. Are those sea stone handcuffs? Smoker asked flatly, eyeing the contraption with a single eyebrow raised. The short answer to that is yes. Merlin responded. It took everything within Smoker's willpower to not slam his own face into the ship's rails at the two's utter moronity. What were you? How did you, I'm not even going to bother asking, he growled in frustration. We were making sure they worked, Smoker-san, Charlie supplied weakly. So you cuffed yourselves together and lost the key, Smoker stated. The two nodded. You two really take after Idiot 1 and some of his company, don't you? Quote. Help us get them off please, Smoker-san, Merlin requested, thrusting their bound hands toward the Vice Admiral. Don't put them near me. Smoker snapped. Have you thought about maybe getting someone else to assist you? Sea stone isn't exactly my strong point. I know how you feel, Charlie groaned. Maybe Captain Tashigi can help us. Yes, now you're actually using your brain. Find her, she probably has the keys. You're going to demote us for this, aren't you? One of them, Smoker didn't take note of which, it could have been either, whined. He massaged his temples, knowing it was too late to keep the headache at bay. Next time you ask me if I'm going to demote you, I really will demote you. Quote. Gya. The two clumsily went about locating Tashigi, Charlie being dragged most of the way. Smoker went back about enjoying the sunshine, wondering how brief this next moment would be before it was interrupted. Around mid-afternoon, Ichigo had decided to tag along with Luffy and Chopper as the two playfully scurried about by the seaside. They'd come to rest at the south end of the harbor, which was a little while away from the harbor beach they'd glimpsed on their tour on the Excelpod, though was still considered a part of the establishment. Ichigo sat in the sand and admired the view as the other two played on the piers. The twin volcanoes loomed in the distance, huge and seemingly peaceful landmasses, not even letting the slightest suggestion of an impending eruption slip by their dormant forms. If it weren't for the remarkable technology the island and its meteorology center had to offer, it would be easy to slip into a false sense of security and receive a rude shock when the volcano did erupt. From the volcanic forms, he followed the patterned sea as waves crashed over what must have been a reef about 70 meters out. This left the water between the reef and the shore calm and clear, ideal for a refreshing dip without being inelegantly dumped by a salty, sandy wall of water. A large and tall pier extended easily 100 meters out into the ocean, its height leaving it unaffected by the breaking waves over the reef. Luffy and Chopper were about 50 meters out on it, over the clear water where there was plenty of coral and sea life to keep them entertained. Ichigo watched as the two ran up and down the dock, apparently amused by how the sun reflected on the smooth surface. He had to admit, the way the colorful stones embedded in the structure shone and glowed when captured by the solar rays looked pretty impressive. But he chuckled at how Chopper and Luffy responded, their excitement and shouts carrying across the seaside and over to him. It was times like this, and nearly every other moment in the waking day, that Ichigo found it hard to believe the two were older than him. They really were like kids. But Ichigo knew otherwise. He'd seen the way Luffy had stared down and fought that puppet guy in Shangpyo. The way Chopper treated his patients and knew exactly which medicines and remedies would be required to achieve the desired results. These two were men in their own areas of expertise. Even if most of the time they were kids. Ichigo lay back on the sand and enjoyed the sunlight bearing down on him. It was amazing how this world could contain islands capable of so many different seasons at once. Back at home, summer had ended. It would be getting cooler. Even if he were to return right now, there would be a noticeable change in daily temperature to what it was during his last day there. A day that already seemed so distant, he gazed up at the endless blue sky and tried to see beyond it. Though under closer inspection, the blue sky was not perfect. Clouds gathered on the horizon. But this was a daily occurrence in Atlantica. Even so, this only meant that the sky would become less and less clear as the day progressed. Next time he'd look upon a completely blue sky would be tomorrow. Disregarding the sky, Ichigo placed his thoughts somewhere else. What was life like at home right now? Urahara surely would have worked out what had happened. Had he sent anyone in search of him? And had the Soul Society caught word of any of these exploits? Probably. And he was probably breaking some rule of theirs by being here. That being the case, he'd be in trouble with them when he returned. Again. Not that he minded at the moment, with the warm sun shining down on him and all. And then of course there was the matter of actually returning, which he'd never actually paid any thought. Zangetsu came first. After that, he'd worry about everything else, from means of returning home, to angry Shinigami that may be awaiting him when he got there. Mesmerized in his thoughts, he did not notice the other two being equally enchanted by the colorful fish in the reef far below them, and leaning over the edge of the dock just that little bit too far. A splash. A shout. Another splash. All that was needed to jerk Ichigo back to attention and alert him that something was wrong. Luffy? Chopper? He called, eyes scanning the now vacant pier. Cursing, he stood and hurried out to the water. It was Luffy's voice that had shouted. It was Chopper's name that had been shouted. They'd gone in. Ichigo's mind had wandered for only a small moment and those idiots had gone in. While he'd been mulling over clouds and such. Trying not to panic, he used Shunpo to cover the many meters over the water near where he'd last seen them playing. They couldn't have fallen, or, in Luffy's likely case, dived, in far from here, surely. Unfortunately, it was in close quarters with the breaking waves, which crashed over the reef and made it difficult to gain proper body control over the ocean's current. They just had to go and choose the roughest part in miles to fall into, didn't they? Ichigo put all home pondering and Zanpakuto thoughts aside. At the moment, these idiots' lives were what came first. Plunging into the salty water, Ichigo immediately went about trying to spot the two. With his eyes peeled, he was quick to locate Chopper. The doctor was drifting helplessly towards the ocean's floor. Quickly, Ichigo kicked at the water and pulled himself in the direction of the sinking figure, catching up before it could sink further. Using the flash-like speed of his Shinigami form, he launched himself and Chopper out of the churning water, where they hovered momentarily before Ichigo spotted the familiar figure of Sanji on the shore. "Oi, Sanji!" he yelled to get the cook's attention. Catch. Quote. Using a skill he had mastered during his first visit to the Soul Society, Ichigo hurled the small reindeer to Sanji with impressive speed, barely managing to glimpse the cook to run forth and catch his crewmate, before returning beneath the surface to rescue the second hammer. Unlike Chopper, however, Luffy was not so easy to find. Whilst the water may have been clear, the seascape was a maze. Ichigo held his breath as he gazed around at the mass of coral and rock caverns that dominated much of the ocean's floor. Coral and sea life that would long have been extinct in his own world drifted by beneath him as he stroked through the cool water, searching for any sign of the Straw Hat Boy. Damn it, where is that idiot? As the moments ticked by, they seemed to last years. He was beginning to panic. It was entirely probable that Luffy had been elsewhere on the pier when he jumped in, and Ichigo hadn't been watching to take note of where. He was beginning to wonder if he should do a hasty search of the pier's entire perimeter when he saw it. The flash of a vibrant red shirt flickered in his field of vision from a cropping in the rock which extended the ocean further below. Ichigo hurriedly swam down into it to find what he'd been searching for what seemed like an age. Luffy helplessly bobbed in the water, the fabric of his shirt entangled with a thorn of mint green coral, part of a prickly reef bed that surrounded him near the ocean's floor. He was nearly directly below the breaking waves, though mostly unaffected by them as they broke on higher-reaching coral above. Even so, each wave sent down a current that caused him to become further entangled with the complex bed of coral. Even if he could swim, he couldn't get out of this on his own, Ichigo realized, before quickly getting to work. All the same, it was not difficult for him to free Luffy from the ocean's clutches. A good tug around the middle and he came unstuck, albeit with his shirt torn. Now all that weighed him down was his own inability to swim. Ichigo secured his arms around the smaller body with ease, before kicking off from the seabed and launching them both to the surface. With a flash, he landed on the shore and immediately set Luffy down in the sand, where he lay unmoving. "Come on, idiot," Ichigo silently pleaded as he steadily compressed the boy's chest. "Don't die on me, not after I went to the trouble of finding you." After a couple of strong pumps, Luffy spluttered and hacked up a few mouthfuls of seawater, freeing his lungs of the unwelcome fluid. Ichigo felt himself physically relax in relief. "Moon guy," Luffy coughed, smiling weakly up at him, trembling as he shifted and tried to pull himself into a sitting position. "Yeah, I'm here," Ichigo answered, patting Luffy's back in confirmation. "Chopper, quote, is safe," Ichigo assured him. Luffy coughed again, slender shoulders heaving as he tried to clear his still waterlogged lungs. Ichigo secured an arm over his shoulders and helped him sit upright. He allowed the pirate to slump against his chest and recover his breath, rubbing soothing circles into his now partially bare back all the while. It occurred to Ichigo he'd never seen Luffy this weak before. But Luffy was a fruit user. He'd just spent a less than healthy for anyone amount of time underwater and was undoubtedly suffering the after effects. It would pass. Approaching footsteps alerted Ichigo to the presence of the other two, whom he seemed to have forgotten about for a short moment. Luffy! Chopper cried, jumping from Sanji's arms into his captain's. Luffy returned the hug of his equally soaking friend. You're bleeding. Chopper soon realized. Luffy looked down at the oozing graze on his upper arm. Hey, you're right, he said in a tone Ichigo easily could have taken for a happy one. It's probably from the coral, Ichigo noted, remembering the spiny twisting shapes that had surrounded Luffy when he'd freed him. I'd better treat it now, Chopper said, we don't want it to get infected. The reindeer set down his backpack and pulled out bandages and gauze, proceeding to treat the minor injuries his captain had sustained. Along the way, Luffy regained his strength, not relying on Ichigo helping him to sit up so much and soon sitting independently, although he winced slightly as Chopper applied some sort of disinfectant to the wound. Ichigo decided now would be the time to ask questions. What were you doing, Luffy? He calmly inquired. Just before you went into the water. Oh, well, Luffy began, Chopper and I were playing on the dock, but then Chopper fell in, so I went to get him. Ichigo sighed. So Luffy had dived in after all. For the sake of the captain's intelligence, he'd hoped that wouldn't have been the answer. And now all the worry he'd experienced whilst searching for Luffy in the maze of coral beneath the water was gone. However, in its place sat another sentiment he felt just as strongly. Anger. You knew I was there, Ichigo said simply. Do you know how much easier it was for me to just go in and grab Chopper than it was to just find you? Quote. It seemed Luffy had not been anticipating for Ichigo to take this approach. That was the fourth time, Ichigo said, taking Luffy's pause to further his argument. That was the fourth time you've risked your life by diving in after someone else while I've been with you. But I'm okay, Luffy reasoned, flexing his limbs and comfortably adjusting to the fresh gauze around his upper arm. Don't you get it? I almost couldn't find you. Ichigo emphasized, frustration growing. But you did find me, Luffy said with a smile. I knew you'd find me, Moon Guy. Ichigo sighed. Was he really still taking this so lightly? Didn't the idiot understand what he was trying to say? Apparently not. But why did you dive after Chopper? He asked. It must have occurred to you that you can't swim any better than he can. Because, Luffy explained, placing a hand atop Chopper's head fondly, a big brother always looks out for a little brother. Ichigo looked on for a moment, stumped, before quickly regaining his composure and sighing. So he was playing it this way, was he? Treating this as something of a family matter. That's beside the point, he said. The best way to look out for him would have been to call me over right away. By diving in after him, you put him in even more danger than he was already. Besides, that doesn't excuse the times you dived in after me. By now, Luffy was no longer smiling. Alright, Ichigo thought, maybe he's finally starting to take this seriously. Well, that's because I felt like diving in after you. Luffy responded, if I wanted, I would have just let you drown. Wait, what? This hadn't been what Ichigo had been anticipating. What part of, I can swim and you can't, don't you understand? You're the one who's a hammer. Well, at least I'm not exploding all the time. Luffy shot back childishly, obviously taking a stab at Ichigo's disastrous attempts at Kido. Hey. That's happened only 4 times. Ichigo retaliated. Yeah. 4 whole times. The same number as the times I've dived into the water when you've been around. So you're going to play it this way? Ichigo said with an exasperated sigh. Sanji and Chopper continuously glanced back and forth at the two's building argument. Hey, Sanji muttered across to Chopper, is this what it's like with me and the Merimo? Quote. A bit, Chopper said with a nod. Only there's more swords and kicking with you guys. You can't take anything seriously, can you? Ichigo questioned in retaliation to something dumb Luffy must have just said. Nope, Luffy said whilst shaking his head, only the part about how you always explode when you try to do magic. By now it was clear he was doing it on purpose simply to get a reaction out of Ichigo. "Oi Captain," Sanji said, finally intervening. "Ichigo has a point. Maybe if you could just cut back from diving in after people." "Ichigo was probably just worried about you," Chopper added. "I wasn't worried about him," Ichigo thoroughly denied as he got to his feet. "He's always so confident, it makes sense he'd be fine. One day he might even start floating because of it. In that case, I might not even bother trying to rescue from the water when it happens again in the future." And without any more words, he made his way back into the city. "Your confidence will really make you float?" Chopper questioned, eyes shining. "How would that make me float?" Luffy snapped. But Ichigo was already too far away. "I wouldn't want you to rescue me anyway." He shouted at the disappearing figure of the substitute Shinigami, before turning to the other two. "Well then, should I try the floating thing?" Quote. "As if," Sanji said as he delivered his captain a whack over the head. About 20 minutes later, Ichigo arrived back at Little Starport and returned to the Thousand Sunny. As he walked onto the deck, he discovered Brook sitting on a crate nearby, using his violin to play a slower version of a tune he sometimes played on piano. "Unexpected swim?" the musician greeted upon noticing him in his still damp clothing. "Yeah, something like that," Ichigo responded, opting to go and change. "You look as though there's something troubling you, Ichigo-kun," Brook said as his long bony fingers prompted the bow into playing the last few notes of the piece, before focusing fully on his company. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ichigo stopped midway back to the men's quarters and turned with a sigh. There was no point in hiding any of it. He could tell that Brook wouldn't be one to pry should he not want to talk about it, but felt he could trust the skeleton with his current state of mind. So he pulled up a crate and took a seat opposite the skeleton, proceeding to recount the events from down by the piers. "I see," Brook said, "not that I have eyes, but I understand your situation." Ichigo couldn't help but roll his own eyes at Brook's unnecessarily necessary comment, before the skeleton shared his opinion on the matter. "Luffy-san's been working hard," Brook said. "It might not seem like it, but he really is trying hard to get us to the place your ghost sword is being kept." "Yeah, I know," Ichigo said, "it's just that sometimes he can be so impulsive. Just jumps into danger without even thinking about it. And you've never done that yourself, Ichigo-kun?" Realizing Brook rose a valid point, Ichigo frowned. "I was referring to the whole diving into the water thing." "Ah," said Brook, reaching down to where a cup of tea sat and sipping at it. "Well, I'd be lying if I said I hadn't done that myself a few times." Ichigo recalled the time when the sea nymphs had just left, and each of the crew's fruit users ended up in the water after Robin accidentally fell in. He suppressed the urge to facepalm. What drove Luffy-san in that situation was his desire to rescue Chopper-kun. He probably didn't even think before diving in after him. "What do you mean, probably?" Ichigo muttered. He was somewhat doubtful that Luffy even thought at the best of times. "But that's what the captain is like," Brook continued, "fast to dive into things without thinking them through. Fast to come to his nakama's aid when they need him." "Well, that's fine," Ichigo admitted, familiar with the urge to protect those he held close, but the problem is the fact he can't swim, and he knows that. He risked both their lives by going in after him. If he'd just asked me for help, the situation wouldn't have been as dangerous. I almost couldn't find him down in the water. And then after I pulled him out, we had an argument and I asked him why he did it." "What did he say?" Brook inquired. "When I asked him why he did it, he said something about a big brother always looking out for a little one." There was a lengthy pause as Brook indulged in a long sip of tea, before placing the cup back down on the ground. "Did he?" he asked eventually. "I thought he might say something like that." "Yeah," Ichigo nodded, "and I didn't say anything about it, but I completely understand that. I have 2 little sisters at home, after all. And I've always sought to protect them." He looked to the skeleton for any further explanation. When none was given, he continued on his own. I guess you all see each other as family, don't you? He assumed. Yes, I suppose we do, Brooke said with a nod. More than just that though, we're each other's family. While we come from some very different backgrounds, somehow we were all able to find each other. No one judges each other based on our pasts, and although we're not related we may feel as though we are. That's what it means to be nakama. And while most of us may have something akin to a family back at our home islands, a few of us don't even have that. Almost all we have is on this ship and within each other. Look at me for example. Nearly all my companions from when I was alive are long dead and turned to bones. Though unlike me, they won't be walking, talking, laughing or playing their music in this world ever again, yo-ho-ho. Ichigo couldn't help but notice Brooke's signature laugh wasn't as heartfelt as its usual jovial quality, and chose to move the discussion along. I guess that makes sense then, he said. After all, in the time he'd been with them he'd noticed the crew shared an incredibly strong bond, far from what he would have expected from a pirate crew. Though there were a lot of things about them he wouldn't have ever expected from any sort of pirate crew before arriving and experiencing it for himself. So Brooke, Ichigo said, deciding to change the subject, that tune you were playing before, can you tell me a little more about it? Quote. Brooke joyfully complied. Of course, Ichigo-kun. Quote. The conversation reshaped into a tale of a small town in West Blue many years earlier, where the origins of the song were born. Ichigo listened on as the musician informed him of the song's meaning, before the topic gradually shifted. I had a nightmare the other night, the skeleton informed him eventually, after the conversation had long since strayed from its original subject. I was in it. Ah, I see, Ichigo chuckled, that would be a nightmare. You and your endless skull jokes. Indeed. My skull jokes will never wear out. Even though I already have worn out, yo-ho-ho. Quote. The joke, like every other that came out of the skeleton's mouth, was bad. But Ichigo didn't care and even laughed along. I've never met anyone with jokes like yours, he said finally. Well, have you ever met another living skeleton? Quote. I can't say I have. Neither can I. Yo-ho-ho-ho. In all my time, not even I've met someone quite like myself. Even if there were another living skeleton, I doubt they'd match your personality, Ichigo said, but you know, everyone's a skeleton underneath their skin. Chapter 18. All comes crashing down. Breakfast this morning was a civil procession. They hadn't bothered moving the table back indoors since the first morning, and had enjoyed their meals on deck and overlooking Atlantica since. The view was great. Sometimes, pterodactyls would glide past and provide a decent moment's entertainment as the sunlight streamed through their translucent wings and reflect over the breakfast table. It was enough to make even Luffy pause from his meal momentarily, mouth full, as he admired the spectacle. Even so, the morning meal went by as quickly as ever, as the crew were anxious to get out and enjoy their final full day on the futuristic, yet prehistoric island. Luffy, Ichigo's voice addressed from across the table about midway through the meal. Sanji braced himself for whatever childish exchanging of insults might occur this time, but was pleasantly surprised by the simple, "Can you pass a bread roll?" Quote. Luffy swallowed his current mouthful whole. "Pass it yourself," he replied simply. "They're right next to you." Ichigo snapped. "Just stretch one over." "Don't wanna." "You don't seem to have a problem with stretching when you want to get food for yourself," the substitute Shinigami retorted. Sanji sighed as Luffy and Ichigo's exchange once again went downhill quicker than a forest fire. It had been like this for the past 3 days now. After the two's initial argument down by the piers, things had only worsened. The pair had not spoken for the remainder of the day, and Sanji hadn't thought much of it, only that it would pass. And pass, it did. The following day, the pair were once again on speaking terms. The manner of speaking that the two exchanged, however, was not friendly as it normally was, but rather bitter and unresolved whenever they interacted. By now, it was likely the two had forgotten what the subject of their dispute was in the first place and were simply fueling one another's resentment. The rift in their relationship was showing no sign of diminishing. And the rest of the crew seemed to have had enough of it as well. "I don't care if you don't care." Ichigo responded to Luffy's latest comment, "Act your age." Quote. "No." Luffy shot back, "You act your age." Quote. Nami sighed and massaged her temples, the exchange between the other two clearly pushing her to the verge of snapping. Sanji took this as a cue to step in. "Why don't you both act your age?" He shot at them, "Or at least wait until breakfast is over with and you're not bothering Nami-san." Luffy and Ichigo turned their attention to Sanji momentarily, before forgetting their dispute for the time being and returning their attention to breakfast. Sanji exhaled as he slid the basket of bread rolls over to Ichigo himself. Must even the smallest of interactions result in a fight? He knew that he and a certain other crew member were bad, but this was just ridiculous. He'd expect no less from a pair of kids. But he'd learned over the past few days that no matter how much he yelled at them to grow up, it was something the two would need to work out on their own. All he or anyone else could do was sit and hope that this stage of their feud, like the silent treatment phase, would pass as well. Tashigi sat on the deck of their ship as the morning ticked by, relaxing as the sun penetrated the large glass windows of Seashell Port, one of Atlantica's large indoor ship ports. The Tenryubito had charge over this island, apparently. Smoker hadn't been overly thrilled when one of the crew had informed them, and Tashigi couldn't say she was thrilled either. But neither was she overly surprised. The world nobles had a habit of showing up in some of the seemingly nicer places in the world, and it wasn't like there was anything anyone could do about it. All the same, it wouldn't stop anyone from enjoying the island's features. She herself had been dragged along to a couple of the dinosaur rallies by Charlie and Merlin, who were probably there right now. Smoker was pretty convinced the Straw Hat crew would be somewhere on the island. But it was a big place, with many different attractions. If the Straw Hats were somewhere on the island, they'd make themselves now eventually. They always did. Otherwise, they'd probably be leaving soon, and in another week the volcanic evacuation would be occurring. Standing, she decided to get as much out of her day as possible. The sun wasn't yet high in the sky and already she could tell it would be a busy day, one way or another. Out of sheer lack of anything else to do, Ichigo took to tagging along with Nami and Sanji for part of the day. They didn't seem to mind, and spent their time revisiting shops and attractions they'd enjoyed throughout their stay. It was nearing lunchtime when they crossed paths with another pair of their crew members. "Hey guys." Luffy waved at them from a distance, his smile as vibrant as ever. For a moment, Ichigo caught himself smiling at the young pirate's cheerfulness. He quickly reverted to his usual scowling exterior, however, when he recalled the current state of his and Luffy's relationship. Luffy began hurrying over, Usopp in tow and a brown paper bag in hand. "Come and see what I got from one of the cool shops," he said whilst swinging the bag tirelessly through the air. "I hope you haven't wasted your money," Nami commented, but seemed to go unheard. "You can all have a look." Luffy invited them over to observe the bag's contents, before turning his back to Ichigo. "Except for you. Stupid alien." "Alien?" Ichigo thought flatly. "Oh, right. Because I'm from the moon." Once Luffy was done with showing off whatever it was he'd bought, Ichigo really couldn't bring himself to care. The group made their way down the street towards a relatively spacious park where they planned to have the lunch Sanji had packed earlier. As they walked along, Ichigo noticed the sizable distance between himself and Luffy. He shrugged and paid it no heed. If anything, he was willing to make that gap a little wider and was sure the captain wouldn't be fazed. If this was how things were, he was just as willing to hold up for as long as Luffy was. So what if it was childish? By responding this, Luffy would be reaping what he sowed. They entered the park and Luffy and Usopp rushed forth to the obscure play equipment, whilst Sanji unloaded lunch onto a picnic bench. Nami took a seat by the bench and pulled out the newspaper she'd obtained earlier and began flicking through. Her attention seemed to pause on one particular page for a while as she read through an article of interest. After a few moments, her gaze wandered over to Ichigo. "Apparently you've been sighted," she reported to him. "Hum?" Ichigo questioned. "They've seen me?" Quote, "They think they've seen you," Nami reported, "but it hasn't been on any of the islands we've been to. They seem pretty convinced it's you though. I feel sorry for whoever it actually is. Looks like he's being chased everywhere for looking like you." "It's not like I can help what the guy looks like," Ichigo said with a shrug. "I guess they'll have to discover it's not me on their own. They can't keep chasing a look-alike forever once they see me with you lot again." "It says he's been seen with someone with bright blue hair," Nami continued. "They're not saying that they think he's Frankie or anything though. But then, they'd need to get more than just the hair right to share any resemblance to that guy. Maybe he's related to Frankie?" Ichigo suggested. Nami arched an auburn eyebrow and laughed. "Don't give them ideas. Just because people have the same hair color, it doesn't mean they're related." Ichigo glanced at her orange hair color, before surveying his own in the glass of the window beside them. "Oh. Right," he said with a laugh. Nami continued flicking through the paper, the limited time she spent on any one page indicating not much else captured her interest. "I actually do have sisters, you know," Ichigo mentioned, filling the lull in their conversation. "They're younger than you though." "I take it they're younger than you as well then?" Nami questioned. "Yeah, by a few years," Ichigo responded with a smile. "They're twins." "Do you often get them mixed up?" Quote, "Not often. They're fraternal and don't look much alike." "I'd hope you don't get them mixed up at all then." "Well, I don't. Not often at least." Nami snickered. "That still means you do." "So what?" said Ichigo. "Only sometimes when I'm tired I might accidentally say one's name instead of the other. I might accidentally say Yuzu instead of Karin or vice versa." "So those are their names?" asked Nami. Ichigo then realized he hadn't mentioned his sisters much at all over the past few weeks. "Well, yeah. Those are nice names," Nami said. "Do you miss them?" Quote, "Yeah," Ichigo admitted, thoughts of home hitting him. During his time with the Straw Hats, he'd been so focused on finding Zangetsu and trying to comprehend the world around him, that he hadn't thought of home much. His mind did wander over to Karakura town from time to time, but not often long enough to consider how he may have missed it. "Yeah, I do, but I've been away from home for long periods of time in the past, and without much explanation too. They probably miss me as well, but they've experienced this kind of thing before. They know I'll come back. I always come back. I understand. I haven't seen my sister in about 3 years, Nami said, but she knows I'll return someday as well. I always have." A moment later, Sanji announced that lunch was set, triggering Luffy and Usopp to come bounding over from the play equipment at the prospect of food. Ichigo quickly finished his lunch and opted to go his own separate way before any words could be exchanged with Luffy. Afternoon came by and Ichigo found himself wandering around Triassic Emporium. Their week on Atlantica was nearly spent. Tomorrow, the log pose would set and they'd be on their way to the next glade in the Isles of Aftardos, whatever that would bring. As that tour guide Pascal had said on their first day, there were only 2 islands making up the next glade. It would be one or the other, and Ichigo had no idea what to expect. Not that he had any idea as to what to expect from any of the other glades they'd so far visited. But the upcoming division of Aftardos seemed different. Foreboding. The fact that not many people chosen to advance beyond the point of the Glade of the Sacrifice gave it an air of mystery that the glades so far hadn't had. All the same, he couldn't deny that the concept of a forgotten paradise, as Pascal and a few others had worded it, sounded tranquil and, at the same time, exciting. Not to mention that the fact that not many had ventured further would only make the captain want to go there more. He had a thing for mysterious objects and places, Ichigo had found. prime destinations for adventure. Speaking of the idiot captain, there he was now, standing right before him and blinking up at him. Of all crew members for him to run into right now. Luffy, he greeted awkwardly. Moon Guy, responded Luffy. The two had not met one-on-one since before their fight had begun, and Ichigo wasn't quite sure how to handle the situation. Would it be easier just to part ways? Or should they talk now? Where's Usopp? He decided there was no harm in asking. He went to get some stuff with Frankie, Luffy replied. Ah, I see, Ichigo nodded. There was an awkward pause, only in which Luffy absent-mindedly picked at his nose. Ichigo realized the discussion was headed nowhere. Listen, about the other day, he began, not entirely sure where the topic would lead, having not even planned what he was going to say. You were kinda an idiot? Luffy simply stared at him. Oh, great starting point, he thought to himself sarcastically, this will go down great. Luffy tilted his head. Oh. Was I? Quote. Wrong move, Ichigo reprimanded himself. He could detect something other than a simple question underlying Luffy's inquiry. I'm pretty sure you already told me that, Luffy continued, did you forget? Or are you kinda an idiot? Quote. I know I've said it before. Ichigo retaliated, but that wasn't the only time. So what? Luffy spat. So what? Your being an idiot is what got me into this mess in the first place. Quote. Huh? Luffy gave him a confused glance, it's not my fault if you're lost. Quote. I'm not lost, Ichigo retorted, I'm talking about back when we first met. If you hadn't gone jumping onto the water after me, I might not have lost Zangetsu. Quote. As soon as the words left Ichigo's mouth, he regretted them. They weren't entirely true. Luffy looked at him blankly. Ichigo tried to discern any feeling or emotion the young captain may have been generating, but found nothing. For an idiot, he was sure good at holding back things when he wanted to. Oh. Well then, Luffy stated simply, voice betraying nothing but blankness as the shade from his straw hat blocked his eyes from view. In that case, I wish you'd stayed on the moon and never come down here. Then we could both be happy. With that, Luffy turned and headed back the way he came. Ichigo stood in the same spot for about a minute, before turning up a road that led to the Dino Cafe. Ellipsis. You mad? Eustace questioned as he entered. Yeah, Ichigo responded. You and your friend are still fighting? Asked Catherine. The Dino Cafe workers had seen enough over the past 3 days to know Ichigo and Luffy's friendship wasn't in the best of conditions right now. Yes, I'm still mad, and yes, we're still fighting, Ichigo said. In fact, we just had our worst argument yet, and now I'm confused about what I'm mad about. Maybe I'm still mad at him for being an idiot and putting himself in danger the other day. Maybe I'm mad at him because we're still fighting. Maybe I'm mad at this entire damn situation, he sighed, and maybe I'm mad at myself for still being mad at him. Wow. You have a lot to be mad about, Catherine commented. It's probably a combination of all those things, you know? Luffy probably feels the same way. I don't know, Ichigo said, shaking his head, I have no idea what that guy thinks most of the time. Then it's entirely likely, Catherine shrugged. Ichigo sat and thought over what had just occurred. He'd let all his recent inner worries concerning Zangetsu out by taking it out by Luffy. And Ichigo knew that Luffy wasn't to blame at all. When he'd fallen through the Garganta, Zangetsu had been far ahead of him, and the Sea King had apparently snared his Zanpakuto pretty fast. If he hadn't been occupied with rescuing Luffy, then maybe it would have snapped him up along with Zangetsu. And then Ichigo would have been in his enemy's clutches this entire time, without any of the interactions with the Straw Hats he'd so far experienced. Ichigo quickly snapped himself out of it. Now wasn't the time for thinking about what could have happened. All those events were in the past. I need some air. I think I might sit outside. Do as you please, Dan responded with a nod. Ichigo left the indoors and sat at a table outside, allowing his mind to wander all the more. Brook had said the other day that Luffy had been trying hard to help find Zangetsu. And just now Ichigo had taken out all his pent-up worries on him. Stupid, Ichigo sighed into the table he'd just pounded his head on. Maybe he'd find Luffy later and apologize. If the Straw Hat Captain was willing to talk to him, at least. Ichigo sighed. Being at ends with Luffy like this just didn't feel right. It was far more tearing than simply being his friend. Being his friend, would Ichigo be given that privilege ever again? Luffy had effectively stated that he wished they'd never met. And it bothered him more than he would admit it. A sudden and confusing disruption jolted his thoughts. Ichigo looked around in confusion as several people out on the street and outside the cafe suddenly and hurriedly knelt down to their knees. Huh? He looked on at the strange spectacle. Ichigo. Winsdoor hissed urgently from nearby, wrenching Ichigo down by the arm. Get down. Quote. Huh? Ichigo was lost in confusion. What's going on? Quote. Just stay down and shut up. One of them is coming though. Ichigo stayed down and looked on. Indeed, someone was coming by. Two someones actually, as Ichigo was soon to discern. His eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. Crawling along on all fours was a human who may once have been a healthy young man. The chains that bound him indicated that he could only be a slave. Atop this man sat one of the most grotesque manners of human Ichigo had ever seen. Greasy and overweight, the being kept his sandy-colored hair tied up in a towering style, wearing a ridiculous all-in-one white suit accented magnificently by an equally ridiculous clear glass bubble over his head. It's Saint Sarov, Ichigo heard someone nearby mutter. Glancing at the man again, he recognized the insignia on the suit as the same on that had been on the flag all those days prior. So he's a Tenryubito, thought Ichigo. The noble stepped down from his slave, kicking him in the gut and muttering something along the lines of worthless. As the Tenryubito began walking towards the cafe, Ichigo felt his blood simmer. Luffy stomped along the shoreline, kicking at loose pebbles as he went. He hadn't meant what he'd said. Ichigo probably hadn't either. They'd both been so caught up in the moment and said things before thinking. Luffy stopped walking and frowned out to the ocean. But Ichigo had been right. When they'd first met, Ichigo had been focused on saving him. He'd been a stranger to him at the time, but Ichigo had been willing to put his pursuit of Zangetsu on hold if only for a moment in order to protect him. And fighting with him didn't sit right with Luffy anymore. It never had. Should he go and find him? He'd probably be at the Dino Cafe or somewhere. Maybe he'd show he was sorry by sharing a bit of meat with him sometime. Again, Luffy began walking. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with a familiar face. Dino Bus Osan. Luffy greeted their tour guide from the first day. Oh, hello there. Pascal returned the greeting. Have you enjoyed your stay on Atlantica? Quote. Luffy nodded, but then paused with a frown. You never said anything about there being any Tenryubito here. Ah, said Pascal, you know about that, it's not something many of the citizens tend to mention. Their palace is deep within the jungle, so they're out of sight most of the time. I know, Luffy said with a nod. Pascal regarded him with a look as though to question whether he entered the forbidden jungle, but then chose not to. It was probably pretty obvious. If it helps matters, I can tell you that one of the Tenryubito are making their way along Mesozoic Square as we speak. What? Luffy asked. Pascal nodded. I believe they'd be passing through the outskirts at the moment. Luffy's eyes widened, his dispute with the substitute Shinigami forgotten. Ichigo. Without another word, he turned and began to run in the direction of the Dino Cafe, eager to make sure his friend would not be targeted. Ichigo looked on as the Tenryubito moved closer. He noticed how the people around him seemed too afraid to make the slightest movement, too afraid that any move they made may be interpreted as some form of threat by the noble. "Where is the person who runs this establishment?" the noble, Surav, inquired. "That would be me," came Dan's voice as he exited the building, and came out into the open. Ichigo watched as the Tenryubito sized him up and down. "This eatery of yours," the noble spoke as though he was standing in the foulest part of a rubbish dump. "I haven't benefited from it." "And what would you have me do about it?" Dan questioned. However, the Tenryubito had his sights elsewhere. "You, young lady," he said, small eyes landing on Catherine, "you're very familiar. Long time, no see, wouldn't you say?" Quote. Catherine avoided eye contact with the noble. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I can kill you for lying to me, you know," Surav stated. "But I won't. Because I'm sure my dear cousin would be thrilled to see you after all this time." "Don't touch her," came Eustace's voice as he rushed forth. "She's done nothing wrong. What happened all those years ago was..." "Another familiar face," the noble muttered, at once pulling a sleek pistol from his robes and pulling the trigger. Ichigo was used to using his fast reflexes and reached Eustace before the bullet had the chance to. He pulled the boy away in a burst of shunpo, the bullet that had been intended for him smashing through one of the cafe's windows. "Are you okay?" Ichigo asked. "Yeah," Eustace said breathlessly, mind lagging and unable to process the entirety of what had just occurred. It had happened very quickly, after all. "And who might you be?" The noble's voice distracted Ichigo's attention from Eustace, as the man regarded the scene through narrowed eyes. He'd so far paid no attention to Ichigo, and was displeased that his attempts to put a bloody hole through his offender had failed. Ichigo had the feeling that this man did not take well to things not going his way. "Look, I'm not entirely certain of who you are," Ichigo said, scowl deepening as he used a tone he didn't use on many occasions, "but back off." A murmuring rang out through their audience. It seemed the spectators were shocked the words that came out of Ichigo's mouth, as well as his actions in saving Eustace. Ichigo didn't understand. What he's supposed to respect this man? This man who was using a human as a slave, treating him in a way that if an animal were to be treated as such in the world Ichigo was used to, various animal rights organizations would be out for his blood? This man whom was demanding respect at gunpoint from the people of this island? Who was willing to shed the blood of innocent people should things not go his way? "All right," the man spoke, his features twisting into a grin as he pointed the pistol into the crowd. "This could be fun. You could protect one person from this gun. Let's see how many more until someone gets killed." With a sharp intake of breath, Ichigo acted before his mind could process what was going on. Unlike the earlier bullet shot from the same pistol, he reached his target. As the gun had fired at the civilians, he reached the barrel, twisting it upwards with a simple jerk of the wrist and sending the bullet harmlessly into the sky. With a hand still firmly around the twisted metal and another locked around the wrist of a hand that wielded said twisted metal, Ichigo answered the Tenryubito with stern words. "I would protect anyone from the likes of you." Chapter 19. What's wrong with the world? The metal barrel of the gun made an unnerving screech as it was bent beyond its intended capacity. Ichigo let it twist further, allowing a small fraction of his anger to simmer forth. "Ichigo." Catherine's voice was first to break the shocked silence. "What are you doing?" Quote. "What does it look like?" Ichigo responded dryly. "I'm making sure this bastard doesn't hurt anyone." He looked the noble in the eye. "Didn't your parents ever tell you not to play with guns?" Quote. All the earlier smugness Surav had displayed when first confronting the cafe had dissolved into a pathetic display of shock. "What is it?" Ichigo questioned. "You've never been on this side of the situation before, have you? How does it feel?" Quote. "You dare to question me?" the noble asked, fury evident in his features. El Santino hissed as the noble shifted forward, apparently trying to regain hold of the now useless gun. Ichigo cast the scrapped metal to the side and shoved the noble away from the crowd of people. The gathered crowd gasped in shock at his actions, but Ichigo didn't care. "Get out of here," he said, "leave these people alone and go home." Surov chuckled. "You think I'll let you get away with this, filthy commoner?" Quote, "You're lucky I'm letting you off like this," Ichigo said, "because believe me, I'm not going to let you get away with anything other than returning to where you came from." "It's too late for that," Surov said. "You have directly assaulted me and I am able to summon a platoon of sturdy marines to eliminate you and your cohorts on my will. You're the one who's not going to get away with this." Quote, "What?" Ichigo asked. "I will have my way." Quote. Before Ichigo could counteract, Surov reached for a strange, shining device around his wrist, and immediately pressed down on a silver button. A screen of smoke accompanied a sudden blaring of a high-pitched alarm. Ichigo could barely see a foot in front of him, and it seemed everyone around him was in a similar state. However, almost as quickly as the smokescreen had materialized, it faded. Still the siren blared, but the noble was nowhere to be seen. The slave he'd bought along with him was gone too, Ichigo noted with a pang of pity. If only he could have helped the guy escape. "He's gone," Winsdor said with a frown. "Sneaky bastard." "Hopefully he stays away," said Eustace. "Where's Catherine?" Dan asked, his eyes scanning the crowd from behind the lenses of his glasses. "She was right here before," it slowly began to dawn on Ichigo, before that noble released the smokescreen. "He's taken her." Winsdor realized. "We need to get her back." Eustace said, "They know who she is, they know who all of us are." Quote, "He did get away with it," Ichigo said, knuckles whitening, before eyeing the three cafe workers questioningly. "He wasn't joking, was he? When he said he'd summon an entire marine platoon to come and dispose of us?" Winsdor shook his head. "Whenever they're wronged, they have the power to summon an admiral or equivalent in an army to eliminate their offenders. If there's one thing for certain, it's that the Marines will be here within the hour." Quote. The skin on Ichigo's knuckles whitened as they were clenched further. "So they behave like that and then the government will attack anyone who stands up to them." "I suggest you find your friends and get out of here," Dan said. "Eustace, you come with me. We're going to find where they've taken Catherine. I'm pretty sure I know where. Winsdor, take El Santino and make sure you find and alert Ichigo's companions of what has happened. With all the ruckus, they just might be able to figure that out for themselves," Winsdor remarked, eyeing an intercom nearby, from where the alarm was sounding. Ichigo glanced at Dan. Everything was happening so fast. "Wait," he said, "I'm not leaving yet, what about you guys?" Quote, "We've dealt with situations like this before," Eustace assured him. "I'm staying," Ichigo insisted. "The Marines are going to be after you as well, and it's my fault they're coming. I'll do my best to hold them off when they arrive, just make sure you get your friend back." "All right then," Dan said, "just know what you've gotten yourself into." The alarms began ringing suddenly and without warning. Zoro halted where he stood somewhere near Triassic Emporium, or somewhere he thought was near Triassic Emporium, at least, and tried to discern the type of signal that was currently blaring across the island. Had he heard this siren before? He wasn't sure. He wasn't one to memorize this sort of thing. At any rate, the noise evoked a state of unease. "I should probably check on the others," he figured, running back the way he thought he'd come. In no time, he found himself opposite the Dino Cafe. Glancing over to the establishment, he realized the area to the front of the cafe was in a state of disarray. Civilians crowded the street, talking in hushed voices as they headed back somewhere they wouldn't become caught up in it. It seemed that whatever action may have just occurred, Zoro had missed it by moments. But judging by the words he picked up as people went by, more could be on its way. As he made his way closer to the epicenter of where the action must have taken place, he noticed the orange-haired Shinigami standing amongst the confusion. "Oi!" Ichigo. He called, breaking into a run. What happened here? Is this the reason that annoying alarm's going? Quote. Ichigo looked over, frantic turmoil reflected in his eyes. Zoro, he said, where is everyone else? Quote. How would I know? Exclamation mark. Zoro retaliated, what happened here, Ichigo? Quote. Ichigo didn't respond straight away, and instead seemed to take interest in the rich turf around his feet. I'm sorry, he said after a moment, I'll explain everything later. This is my responsibility, so don't get involved. Without another word, he used his flash step to leave the scene. Well, thanks for the information, Zoro said flatly, before turning to the Dino Cafe members he recognized. Hey, what happened? He asked them, did Ichigo do something stupid? Quote. They took Catherine. Winsdor muttered. Who's they? Quote. The Tenryubito came, Dan said distastefully. The Tenryubito, Zoro repeated to himself, the 4 syllables rolling off his tongue bitterly. He eyed the blaring intercom, an eyebrow raised. And let me guess, he said, Ichigo gave that bastard what was coming. Quote. Eustace nodded. Yes. Zoro couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction upon hearing this. But then, of course, he remembered all too well how the consequences of their last encounter with the Tenryubito had ended. The memory made him want to quickly locate the rest of the crew to make sure they were all accounted for, even though he knew they all would be. Having been the first to be zapped away by Kuma back at Sabaody, he hadn't seen what had happened to the others. The uncertain feelings that had threatened them during the first few weeks, before he was sure of the others' safety, were something he'd promised he'd never have to feel again. Besides, they were stronger now. Far stronger. The incident that had occurred at the Sabaody archipelago would never happen again, not if he could help it. Zoro turned to the remaining civilians. If you don't want to be pulled into this mess, go back to your homes and don't leave until sunrise. Whatever's going to happen will be settled by then. The majority of the remaining civilians nodded and complied, or at least left the scene. We're sorry you had to get dragged into our troubles like this, Dan said, but for now, I would advise for you to take your crew and go. No, Zoro responded, we've been dragged into this mess just as much as you have. Whether any of us like it or not, we're in this together now. Just like what Ichigo said. Both so stubborn, Dan remarked before smirking, though that's not always a bad quality. Very well then, do as you wish. If it helps any, we've been in a similar situation to this before, Zoro said, with an admiral coming and all that. There are no admiral-class marines around these parts at the moment though, Dan said. From what I've heard, they've been preoccupied with other things. Though knowing the power of the marines, they'll be sending something equal to an admiral. So we can't let our guards down. I wasn't planning to anyway, Zoro said, though I need to find my crew. El Santino and I can help you there, Winsdor said, as the plesiosaur scooted to his side. All right then, Dan, Eustace said, should we go? Quote. Dan nodded. Port number 4 is forbidden from the general public for a reason. It's likely she was taken there. He then turned to Zoro and Winsdor, regroup by the hill of the Roostersaurus in half an hour. And bear in mind that even if we make it out of this, there's no way we can remain in Atlantica. Smoker was beginning to wonder whether or not the Straw Hats were on the island. He still hadn't noticed any sign of them, and the thought occurred to him that he and his crew may have just been pointlessly wasting away their time on the prehistoric island. Having had that in mind, Atlantica was still a large and busy place, and it was entirely possible that the crew had somehow managed to slip by without him noticing, under the cover of the lively city. But Smoker stuck by the philosophy he always followed: if the Straw Hats were in Atlantica, it would only be a matter of time before he knew about it. This philosophy would soon be proven quite accurate. Smoker-san. One of his officers hurried over to him frantically. What is it? Smoker sighed, exhaling a cloud of smoke. It's the Straw Hats, the officer panted. So they've finally made their presence known? I guess it was bound to happen, Smoker said. Where did you see them? It's not just that, Smoker-san, the officer said, shaking his head, that one you were speaking to back in Shangpyo, who they call Nami's brother. He stood up to one of the Tenryubido. Quote. A clump of ash fell from the end of Smoker's cigar. He did what? Quote. Can you hear that alarm? The officer questioned him. Other Marines have been called to eliminate them. Damn it, Smoker cursed. That shitty noble probably just got what he deserved, and because of that, a whole platoon are on their way to capture Luffy, and that's our mission. What will we do, Smoker-san? The officer asked. We'll do what we've always done. Continue pursuing Straw Hat ourselves, Smoker replied, and hope that the skills he and his crew have always been able to demonstrate in evading us can be transitioned to the platoon that are coming. Locate Tashigi and the others, and ensure that they are informed of this. Yes, sir. What have I done? Ichigo ran along, trying to subdue his wide-eyed shock. The results of his hasty actions were unfolding in the worst possible way, and there was nothing he could do about it. There was no reversing what had been done. In grasping hold of the noble's wrist to prevent him from harming anyone, in shoving him away from the crowd, Ichigo had apparently opposed the world government. As such, a platoon of Marine officers would be on its way. His friends were in danger because of his actions, though if it weren't for those actions someone could have been killed. What's wrong with these people? Exclamation mark. Ichigo grit his teeth as he pushed himself to run faster. What are human lives to them? Exclamation mark. How can they get away with this? He put his anger aside and chose to focus on the task at hand. The platoon would be arriving soon and he planned on meeting them on the shore when they did. He had the feeling that they wouldn't be ones to simply talk around the situation, though he had more than a few things to say to them regarding the matter. This is my responsibility, he thought. I can't let anyone be captured because of my actions. Hopefully Zoro can warn everyone so that they can get out in time. He felt his heart sink a little as the reality of the situation hit him again, this time with the prospect of the crew and whatever their thoughts on the matter might be in mind. I've put them in danger, I've gotten the Marines onto them, he thought once again. What will Luffy think? Ichigo came to an abrupt halt upon reaching the shore, having not given himself enough time to slow into a smooth stop. And then he stood and waited, eyes never leaving the spot the sea and the sky met. The sun was sinking lower and lower on the horizon line. Soon it would be gone altogether. Already in the distance, he could make out two Marine ships advancing on Atlantica. Ichigo stood firm and waited, a hand ready to fly to the hilt of his borrowed katana when necessary. He would personally make sure that none of his friends would be hurt thanks to him. It was the least he could do. It didn't take long to locate everyone. El Santino's sense of scent proved second to none. Windsor rewarded him by granting him a small morsel of sea life, of which the plesiosaur was currently gnawing on. They had gathered by the hill of the Roostersaurus, and Windsor and Zoro had filled the others in on the details. Ichigo's gone to meet the Marines on the shore and try to keep them contained, Windsor explained. And he's gone alone, that idiot, Zoro added. Luffy hadn't spoken for the duration of the discussion. It was likely he was mulling over what had occurred, but Zoro knew better than to guess what could have been going on in his captain's mind right now. Like Zoro, he was probably reflecting on their last encounter with the world nobles. Zoro watched as Luffy's eyes met his, and an understanding was made. Once we know what's going on, we'll get out of this mess, was the vibe silently communicated. He won't be alone for long, Sanji said as though to speak for both of them. We'll join him soon enough. Should someone go and assist Ichigo-san now? Brook questioned after a moment. The other two will probably have returned before the Marines can get here, Robin said. It might benefit us to hear something from them before someone goes out to find him. At any rate, Windsor continued, it would be best for us to stay here until we get word from Dan and Eustace. Besides, It's likely that the port where your ship is located underwent a lockdown by the few marine officers operating on this island when the alarm went off earlier. Some of those marines would be looking for us right now. You know, your ship is going to be difficult to get to it, but I think I know a way it could work. We have a boat as well. We've always had one in case something like this happened. You and your friends seem to know a lot for a group of cafe owners, Sanji remarked. Who are you, anyway? Quote. That's a question for another time, Winsdor responded. Looking out over the hill, right now, we should focus on our current predicament. Dan and Eustace will meet with us soon and inform us of the situation. It's really empty in here, Eustace commented. I've never seen a port so bare. Keep your voice down. This place is off limits because it's where the nobles do all their dirty work, Dan explained. They probably house slaves and prisoners here when they're not being used, so she's probably somewhere in here. Eustace nodded and the two silently continued through the emptiness of the port, hiding in shadows and behind crates. Ah, there. Eustace noted upon sighting a cell as they neared the ramp up to the second level. Catherine sat within the confinements of the dark enclosure, her expression unreadable. There are others as well, Dan noted. In another cell opposite Catherine, a group of about a dozen people were crammed, clothed in rags and some with burnt-on imprints apparent on their skin. Slaves, Dan observed, noticing the man that the Tenryubito from earlier had used as a vehicle among them. Should we? Eustace began, standing and taking a step toward the cells, capturing the attention of Catherine. For a moment, she looked relieved to see them, but quickly made hurried shooing gestures with her hand when a few sets of footsteps began filling the interior of the port. They're here, she mouthed. Dan quickly pulled Eustace back into the shadows and held a finger to his mouth. Almost immediately afterwards, Sarav and one of the other Tenryubito, a woman dressed in a similar manner with dark purple hair, arrived. Lilac, Eustace believed she was called, accompanied with a man who must have been an advisor. Oh, well, look at this. Lilac jittered in an unpleasantly shrill voice as she observed Catherine behind the bars. It really is you. The lower-class noble girl who actually thought she could decline her betrothal, dear cousin Carlos. Well, I didn't end up marrying him, Catherine pointed out, so I guess I succeeded. Only because you ran, undeserving brat. Oh, trust me, Catherine assured, I'd planned on escaping long before that. By the time I was 13, I'd begun to think for myself. So when that dear oafish Carlos of yours came by 3 years later and decided he wanted to add me to his wife collection, I had no more excuses not to make my move. Any other lower-class noble would kill to be given the privilege to marry into the Tenryubito line, Lilac said. What you unlawfully declined brought shame upon your kingdom. Your family disowned you. I disowned them first. Besides, it's been 6 years since then. They've probably replaced me with someone else to try and impress you low-life Tenryubito with. You will speak to us with respect, scum, the woman spat. Well then, Catherine said curtly, with all due respect, that pig Carlos has more wives than he can count. Probably more fingers than he can count, at that. He doesn't want you anymore anyway, Lilac said, her lips twisting into an awful smile. When I spoke to him just now, he barely even remembered you. Figures. I would take you as my own wife, but I find you rather plain for my liking, Sarav said. I'll count that as a blessing, Catherine muttered. But what to do now? Lilac questioned in mock contemplation. You're a wanted woman, Lady Mildred Levine. Catherine flinched at the name. Or is it Catherine Copernicus now? How charming. I imagine those cronies of yours have changed their names as well. They're here on this island too, aren't they? That slave, the failed experiment and the slave's brother? Quote. What's it to you? Quote. I suppose you're right. The combined bounty of you four is barely even enough to provide me a night's entertainment. You're just as expendable as them, Lady Mildred, she indicated to the cell of slaves opposite, and as such, you will leave this world with them. Always the dramatic ones, Catherine murmured, rolling her eyes. Lilac gave a shrill laugh. "Oh, Lady Mildred, I wasn't joking." "What do you mean?" Catherine demanded, glancing across to the slaves. "What are you going to do to these people?" Quote, "Oh, you'll find out," Lilac giggled. "Mochu, when is the volcano due to strike?" Sarov questioned the so far silent advisor. "The eruption isn't due for another week, sire," Mochu informed him. Sarov frowned, his heinous features becoming all the more glum. "That's no good. I want it now." He eyed the cell of slaves. "I don't want to be burdened with these defective merchandise longer, and I want the entertainment. With all due respect, sire, we are unable to control the forces of nature." "Didn't you hear me? I want this volcano to come faster. I want it to come now." "Sire, even if it were to come now, preparations for the evacuations of civilians don't start until tomorrow," Mochu reasoned. "Do you want to be locked in the cell and suffocate like one of them?" Sarov threatened. "Since when did the civilians matter? They're worth no more than the slaves. What will it matter if they perish along with them?" Quote, Eustace's shoulder ached with the strain of Dan holding him back from charging. "What if something were to trigger its eruption, Mochu dear?" Lilac asked sweetly. The advisor thought for a moment. For an eruption of that scale to occur, it would have to be brought on by another natural means, like an earthquake. Now if the user of that powerful fruit were here and willing, they could make that happen for us, but... "You do not need a fruit to cause an earthquake," Lilac said. "That's right," Sarov said. "Beneath the waters of the southwestern coast, a series of landmines lie buried. I wish to detonate them." "Very well," Mochu complied. "Do as you please." Eustace turned to his accomplice. "This is bad," he said. "We need to stop them." "I'm not sure we can do that," Dan said, eyes still focused on the nobles before them. Eustace followed his gaze to discover Sarov retrieving a round device from within his robes. "I've been waiting so long to use this," the noble chuckled, before jabbing a cavity in the sphere with his finger. The blast could be heard, even from where they were. "The other two should be back any moment," Winsdor said. "I hope so," Nami said. Luffy was becoming restless and causing the other boys to play up. Nami sighed. They were mere hours away from the log pose setting and this had befallen them. Tenryubito, Marines, all the greatest this island had to offer. It seemed as though things couldn't get more complicated. No sooner had this thought entered her mind, it sounded. An enormous blast from the sea on the island's southwestern coast. An incredible force shook from somewhere within the earth, taking everyone by surprise and causing them to latch onto the nearest stable object. It lasted for only around 15 seconds, but was enough to tear everyone's attention from the Tenryubito problem. What was that all about? Usopp stammered from where he and Chopper hung off Frankie. "Something exploded," Frankie said. "That earthquake," Nami said with a frown as she glanced out over the ocean and toward the volcanic mountains. "Could it cause us some problems?" Quote, Another tremor began in the ground, subtly at first, but with increasing intensity, before coming to a sudden and unnerving calm. "Shit," Winsdor cursed. "It's here. What bad timing." Atlantica's meteorology center buzzed unpleasantly as two different sirens blared. The one announcing the distress of a Tenryubito had been going for a while now, and could not be silenced until the arrival of the Marines. Luckily, that would be pretty soon. However, the new siren was different. It was set at a lower pitch and blared at a much slower tempo. But it was loud and distinguishable, recognized and dreaded by virtually all of Atlantica's residents. Drat. A young researcher cursed. How could we have been so careless? Hey, it's not like we had any power over what happened, another pointed out. Since that earthquake was caused by a detonation, we didn't see it coming. The head researcher observed the fluctuating patterns on the screen of his computer warily as volcanic friction began to rise. Whether it was caused by natural means or not, the outcome is the same, he informed his two students. It's unlocked something deep within the crust, Send word to prepare the evacuations immediately. It's only a matter of time. Mount Jumble will be erupting a week early.
Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. Apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See ya next time.